Olá, boa tarde, sejam bem-vindas todos e todos para a conferência da professora Myria Georgiou, que infelizmente não pôde ser presencial, como foi planejado inicialmente, como a gente gostaria, em função das condições atuais, as fortes chuvas que ocorreram em Belo Horizonte e ao aumento dos casos de Covid-19, né, da infecção por Covid-19, mas eu tenho certeza que teremos um momento extremamente interessante, um debate super produtivo, né? E em sequência teremos a participação também do professor Bart Kamertz. Eu agradeço muito a disponibilidade da professora Myria. Thank you, Myria, very much for being with us again. I hope there will be much other opportunities here, even here in Belo Horizonte. One day it will happen, I guess. And queria parabenizar as professoras Laura Guimarães e a professora Ana Carolina Vamiero pela organização, inclusive pelo esforço grande de adaptar esse ciclo de conferências e os seminários a essas condições tão adversas. Então, passo a palavra agora para que a gente inicie essa tarde tão produtiva.
Boa tarde a todos e todas que estão nos assistindo ao vivo ou na gravação. É com muito prazer que recebemos a professora Myria Georgiou e o professor Bart Kamertz nessa tarde de hoje, nos seminários LSI UFMG. A professora Myria Georgiou vai fazer uma conferência cujo título é Digital City from the Bottom Up, Contested Humanisms as Claims to the Digital City. Eu agora vou falar em inglês, nossa convidada vem, our guest, Professor Myria Georgiou, comes from LSE, London School of Economics and Political Science, e ela é professora titular do departamento de mídia e comunicações da London School, da LSE, onde também atua como diretora de pesquisa. Ela investiga e ensina sobre migração e urbanização no contexto de mediação intensificada. Autora e editora, organizadora de 4 livros e mais de 60 artigos, seu trabalho já foi publicado em inglês, francês, português, japonês e grego. Trabalhou como jornalista para o BBC World Service, a imprensa grega e a Cyprus Broadcasting Corporation. A sua área de expertise é migração e mídia, cidades, comunicação urbana, identidade e diáspora, comunidades e redes transnacionais, pesquisa de público, mídia e vida cotidiana. Professor Myria Georgiou, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being with us. Now we'll start with the conference, and then we are open to Q&A, questions and answers, and I'll be here to help you with the mediation and with the moderation and the translation of this event. So yeah, have a nice afternoon, all of you. Thank you, Myria.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Bruno. Thanks to the university for this kind invite. It's a shame that we cannot all be in the same room, but it's a great pleasure to reconnect with you and the audience at UFMG, and to have the opportunity to share some thoughts and some of my most recent work, especially some of the ideas that I have been working around in relation to debates about the kind of values, ideas, and orders that the project of digital cities presents to us. So I cannot seem to be able to bring my slides. Yes, there they are. So as Laura kindly said in her introduction, the title of my talk today is Digital City from the Bottom Up, with the subtitle Contested Humanisms as Claims to the Digital City. So what is this debate about, and why should we be thinking about the digital city? Perhaps this might be an unfamiliar idea to you, but hopefully as I go through the presentation, and even though of course I'm giving this talk from a specific vantage point and from a part of the world that I know most of, I hope that you will find some relevance in this debate and also some familiarity to some of the arguments I will make in relation to the experiences and the ways that you see cities like Belo Horizonte and other cities in Brazil transforming or being claimed to transform through digital communications. So let me just start from the very fundamental ways, or the very basic or popular ways through which we understand what digital cities are about. So we have images of the digital city that might look like that. So cities, digital cities, are supposed to be visionary sites of hyperconnectivity in relation especially to urban transformations that we often encounter through the concept of the smart city. Digital cities are also perhaps sites of data extraction and surveillance, because very often the intensification of digital connectivity in the cities is very much connected to centers of surveillance and control of the city, such as those as we can see on the screen, enabling or enhancing surveillance in cities, especially through data and digital infrastructures. Or digital city, more and more we see being about the ordinary city, where seemingly people live and can live better, happier, and good lives with technology. The concept of the digital city is diverse and both scholarly and also in its applications has different expressions around the world. But even though the digital city has its distinct variations in scholarly interpretation and in applications, it has become a global vision. And it has become a global trajectory which engages from the top down, the state, corporations, including but not limited to digital corporations, and of course the media, that are also very much involved in shaping narratives around digital cities. Having a global vision and having an advance of a global vision of the digital city does not mean that this is a unified or homogeneous trajectory. It is, of course, a very uneven project with very diverse and contradictory ideologies hidden behind it, as I will try to demonstrate today. But just to continue this contextualization of the discussion that I will start in a minute, Brazil is part of this global trajectory. And some of you might know or might not know that in various global networks of smart cities or digital cities, Brazil appears quite high as seemingly being one of the countries that is making important advances in relation to the so-called key indicators of what makes smart cities. And we can see in the top of the slide some of those indicators according to the Connected Smart Cities Network that emphasize what a smart city or digital city. I will be using the concept somehow interchangeably because they are used interchangeably in many ways. And we can see what makes a smart digital city. I highlight especially the elements of the environment, better environment, health, education, security, and entrepreneurship. And you can see according to the same indicators, the top 5 smart cities according to the Connected Smart Cities Network, with each one of them being smart in a particular way, performing very well as a smart digital city in a particular way. And Belo Horizonte apparently is performing well because of the positive atmosphere it creates for innovation. So we can see those debates, as I already mentioned, about digital cities as being shaped from the top down, from policymakers and corporations, imagining and proposing that there is something very important and very much something that we take for granted as being positive about what digital cities are. digital cities are better because they function better with the support of digital technologies, but they are also better, and there's no question why we should be against the project of digital cities, because they propose that they make the life of people better. So this is the dominant background, and if you like, the dominant imaginaries about how we might start thinking about the digital city. So the digital city is a diverse and uneven trajectory of urban development, represents one of the biggest projects at the moment around urban transformation, digital change, but also, as I would argue, also a major project with important social and ideological implications. Digital cities, I will try to show, presents a social and ideological experiment that is very much attached to the specific times that we live, the times of crisis, and it comes to offer an alternative to many of the problems inherent to the current moment of capitalism in which we live. Today, I want to argue that we need to study the digital city not as a technological project alone, but instead as an ideological project. We cannot just think of the digital city as yet another site of intensified digitization or even of surveillance capitalism alone, as perhaps some of the images and some of the information that I shared already would invite us to do. Instead, I think, and I will try to demonstrate, that digital cities represent a key ideological site of struggle. On the one hand, they're pushed by powerful actors, especially state, corporations, and the media. They're used on the basis of technological transformation in order to diffuse dissent and equitable claims to the right to the city. On the other hand, the technologies that come with digital transformation on the city are used for another kind of conceptualization of digital lives. So technology is also used by those who are denied the right to the city in order to make some claims to resources and to dignity in the city. So digital cities, I argue, are not unique, but it's a very important example of the changing regimes of power in the context of global neoliberal and racial capitalism, which is currently under fire and in crisis. And the digital city represents one of those contradictory sides of trajectories of post-neoliberalism. Not to promise, and it does so because it is not a project anymore that proposes just technological transformation, but more and more the digital city has become one of those key sites where what we are promised is a better world for humans, on behalf of the humans, and in the name of humans. So as I will try to show in this talk, the project of the digital city has shifted from the first generation of the development of smart cities into which has been primarily a bureaucratic and technocentric and techno-utopian project, has shifted into a project that is now human-centric. It is presented as a project that is not about the technology, but technology appears as the tool for a better world on behalf and for humans. What does it mean and why does it matter? What I will try to show in the rest of this conference lecture is that what we see in the cities is the use, the narrative, and the practice use of digital transformation within the context of different humanisms, what I refer to as popular humanism, demotic humanism, and critical humanism, to represent different kinds of interest and claims, again, for changing cities in the context of a world, of a neoliberal world in a crisis. So I want to start by referring to to the articulations of digital transformation in the urban world, as this takes place in a top-down way, especially through the narratives and the imaginaries, the socio-technical imaginaries that we are seeing circulating, again in uneven ways, but that they are circulating across the world, especially through the state networks, corporate networks, and the media. So when I started working on this project for my forthcoming book on the lives of digital cities, I was actually puzzled to come across some of the transformations in the imaginaries of the digital city. And it was in fact the findings in my research that made me frame my understanding of digital cities as an ideological project that are leading my conference lecture today. So when I went out to start studying how the digital city is imagined, especially from among the powerful actors of the digital city, I was expecting a lot of narratives about technological utopianism. I expected to find a lot about how technology is actually the panacea, the center of how our cities should be lived and how they should turn, something quite futuristic and driven, narratives driven by the magic bullet of technological transformation. Instead, I have come across visuals and narratives that you can see on your screen now. So looking at different media and policy documentations, I have seen the project of the digital city not being represented as a project about technological futuristic transformation, but rather being presented as a human-centric project. This for me was puzzling, and I will offer in a few minutes my interpretation after I give you some examples of what that means. So in the Forbes business magazine, you read a title that says "Delete Technology, Add Humans" when they're talking about digital cities. The Telegraph, a big series newspaper in the UK, talks about the digital city of the people, by the people, for the people. Dell, one of the corporations that are behind many of the projects of digital cities in the world, talks about optimized, data analytic-driven, but also people-centric solutions in the digital cities of tomorrow. UN Habitat talks about building people-centered smart cities from the ground up. And other networks are talking about building stronger communities in the US, in Europe, in Asia, in North Africa, and so on, creating opportunities for all, advancing inclusion through digital inclusivity. So for me, that was puzzling, and it also shows that precise transformation of the digital city that I'm claiming here as an ideological rather than an infrastructural project. At the same time, as you can see on the visuals on the other side of the screen, we see an advancement of a progressive ideas and narratives of what the city represents, very often to what we might often call the hashtag activism. So we see hashtag activism spreading across the cities, but also spreading both on the digital street and on the material street that supports feminist causes for racial justice, as we can see some of the examples, with the city becoming precisely that space that is both physical and virtual, within which those progressive values for social justice, gender studies, racial studies are being represented. So the city is not, is in many ways reimagined technologically through hashtag activism, and it's reimagined technologically through those approaches that we see from powerful actors that are pushing forward this curious, if you like, human centrism of why we should have more, better and deeper digital connectivity across cities. So this curious human-centrism that we see in the hegemonic imaginaries of the digital city, to me, comes to explain how technology is being reconfigured itself, and digital technologies and communication technologies are becoming reconfigured themselves as a tool to move away popular imaginaries away from sides of conflict, dissent, and mistrust, into sides where we can reimagine society away from the tensions of capitalism, and rather through those ideals that we can build better societies by employing different communication technologies in our life. So the rise of this human centrism of the digital cities is not coming out of nowhere, and it is specifically located within that time that we live in. And this is a time of the perpetual crisis of capitalism. We have the financial crisis that starts in 2008, the epidemiological crisis we're experiencing now, the environmental crisis, and so on and so forth. And of course, those crises become much more apparent in our cities. At the same time, we have the growth of public mistrust, both to the institutions of liberal capitalism or neoliberal capitalism, but also the rise of mistrust towards the big tech. So we have scandals like Cambridge Analytica, skepticism, and a rising hostility against the likes of Facebook, and so on. So the economic and political system are in crisis, but also technology, for the sake of technology, and as an alternative pole to the crisis of capitalism, is also under crisis. This happened at the same time that, from the bottom up, we have a rise of social movements that are contesting racial, gender, class, order, and so on. And these movements, again, are located in cities. So what we see is that cities are becoming very tense locations where the crisis of neoliberal racial capitalism are now intensifying. And there are also sites where that crisis of the digital utopia is also demystified. And the critique of surveillance capitalism and data colonialism, for example, are becoming quite diffuse within these same networks of dissent in the city. So cities and the powerful actors in the city, I would argue, use those projects of digital cities and the advancement of the digital city to project a post-neoliberal and progressive capitalism that is not anymore about growth or about profit. So those narratives of neoliberal capitalism have become bankrupt, and instead we have technology, but not technology for surveillance, not technology for mass datification and data colonialism, but we have technology that can bring in new possibilities for a new humanism, what I refer to as popular humanism. So what I think comes behind this curious human centrism of the hegemonic imaginaries of digital cities that transform the aim and the reason why there is investment, both in the infrastructures, but also in the vision of the digital cities, I argue, has moved away from being an issue of technology, an issue of technological transformation, and it has become more of a site for diffusing dissent and conflict in the city and redirecting public popular imagination into this ideal that we can have human-centric cities only because technologies can help us to do that, even if on the background capitalism, neoliberal and racial capitalism, is under huge crisis. So how is this popular humanism, how do I understand the rise of this popular humanism and how it is expressed? I gave you some examples of the hashtag activism, we can see corporations, we can see cafes, restaurants, urban governments, digital corporations using the language of social justice. And we're seeing also the same corporations, the government, as we can see on the smart city indicators, using the promise of a better, more human, more livable, more environmentally sustainable world to advance all those ideals through technology. So what is going on? So to interpret all this empirical material that I come across, I see this human centrism of the hegemonic imaginaries of digital cities as represented in this popular humanism. So what we see empirically is a gradual but systematic shift in the language towards a language of human-centric progress and innovation, which replaces discredited neoliberal discourse of growth and profit and of big tech deregulation. So I have analyzed a large number of media articles, of corporate articles, of international organization declarations that very much avoid to talk about growth and profit and any of the language that we associate with the neoliberal discourse of how cities should be shaped. Instead, more and more they're talking about human cities, and they're using these ideals of the human cities to justify, again, that investment in technology. The human, of course, in all these narratives is always presented as an individual, digital savvy subject and open-minded that now can symbolically be elevated beyond to the biopolitical moral compass in the name of whom urban digital futures become necessary. This becomes a response to capitalism crisis. So the humans are assumed in these dominant socio-technical narratives as driving progress through technology. They're not just on the background of progress or of change that is led by corporations or the state. Instead, they're at the center of these shifts in the urban trajectories. Structural inequalities and collectivities, of course, seem to not really appear in this dominant socio-technical imaginary, but instead they're replaced by a techno-optimism and that individual resilience. People will rise above the crisis of the urban world, and they will do that because technology can help them to do it. The discourse of the digital city, that human-centric digital city, recognizes problems with data extraction, environmental emergency, and social exclusions, and offers a technological pathway as progressive and common sense, a path that is never transformative, of course, and never challenges systemic order of things. So the human-centric hegemonic socio-technical imaginaries of the digital city are progressive. They are progressive because they incorporate these precise crises that we can see expressed in the cities, not least through the rise of urban social movements. The discourse of the digital city recognizes popular humanism. Moving to the next point, popular humanism reinvents order for times of capitalist fragility by making order look open and inclusive via digital innovation. And the prominence of hashtag campaigning is important here. In my book, I talk about the rise of digital order through this popular humanism. I don't have time to talk about it here, but what we see also is that the powerful actors of the city that push this popular humanism avoid to talk about order as anything that has to do with surveillance, anything that has to do with policing. Again, issues that have been contested repeatedly in cities and through social movements around the world. And popular humanism emerges as an order of discourse that sets key rhetorical parameters for imagining the city while disguising deep urban inequalities and excluding alternative imaginaries and experiences that take place at the margins of the city. So what happens with this popular humanism is that we see the production and reproduction of that constant and persuasive in many ways progressive discourse that we can use technology to make a better world, a more sustainable world, a more equitable world. But of course, we never challenge the system. In these discourses, the systems and the deep structural inequalities and the alternative imaginaries of the city are pushed aside. And this brings me to the questions I'm raising as I move to the second part of my talk about this curious human centrism in the hegemonic socio-technical imaginaries of the digital city. What does it include and what does it exclude? What it constantly does by incorporating progressive values, popular humanism is really pushing away the voices from the margins, the voices that do not fit within the imaginaries of the digital savvy, individualistic and resilient individual that can use technologies in a sophisticated ways to make the most of the city and to also advance better ways of life. So the question that inevitably comes to me after observing those hegemonic socio-technical imaginaries is, what is missing here? So what does the digital city look like if we start exploring it from the margins rather than from the center? Popular humanism is all about the imaginaries of the city as they emerge from the centers of power. How does it look like, the digital city, if we explore it from the margins instead of the center? And here, of course, I'm inspired by works of scholars, not least by Bell Hooks, who has done work on margins and what it means to live on the margins of the urban world, that, as she says, to be in the margins is to be part of the whole, but outside the main body. So the margins of the city is part of the whole, but repeatedly, and we see here new expressions that they're outside the imaginaries or the dominant imaginaries of what the city is, should be like, and consequently what the human is and should be like within digital cities. But of course, the margins are not only sites of exclusion, silencing, and invisibility, but they are also sides of reclaiming the digital city and its humanity. And this is where I come in to think about how we can think about a different kind of humanism emerging in the digital city and around the project of the digital city, as this is expressed through the experience and through the narratives of people who don't have power, who live on the margins of the city. And even though this kind of different humanism that I see emerge in the city are not contained only to the experience of migrants, I'm using the case of migrants because this is urban migrants, because this is a case that I know the most. This is a case that I have been studying over the many recent years, and this is a case where I understand that alternative kind of humanism that emerges in the city, what I refer to as the demotic humanism, which I will explain in a minute. So is the digital city, if we think about it from the margins and not from the center, can we imagine digital cities as cities of refuge, as places where people who are seeking security can find a home, can find a place for access to resources, but also to dignity? The empirical reality, of course, is that, and here I have some data from Europe, but I don't think is unique to Europe. The largest numbers of migrants usually move to cities. in different parts of the world. This is what research and migration shows. So Mackenzie, for example, in that second point on the slide, reminds us that refugees don't move to nations, they move to cities. Cities become those contradictory digital spaces. So the digital city becomes a data border, for example, as technologies of surveillance are extending in the cities, not only on the outer borders of nations, to survey and to control the mobility of migrants. We have digital cities in the context of migration that are paradoxical and contradictory. So technologically, cities become sites of intensified control, but also because they tend to have those better digital infrastructures, they become also sites for heightened opportunity for agency, resistance, and claims to the right of the city among migrants compared to other places. So what I have observed, I have spoken so far about what I have observed in my studies of the hegemonic socio-technical imaginaries as they emerge from those in positions of power in different cities in the world. And again, even though primarily I work in Europe, I have also observed and analyzed material from international organizations and in some cities in other parts of the world. So I focus on that first part in thinking about popular humanism in relation to those hegemonic narratives. And I now want to turn to this other side of my work in cities that is centered in the life, in the experience, and in the narratives of migrants and refugees to see what is that other possibility of thinking, of imagining, and of living as human in digital cities. So what is that alternative? So could it be that we can think of the digital city through the experiences of the Latin American migrant community in London who have been expelled from the center, the physical center of their community in London, and instead they have been forced to move from their physical hub into a digital hub, and you can see My Elephant story as being part of that. Isn't that part of the digital city? And what kind of humanism does it represent? Isn't the digital city part of isn't the digital city expressed in the experience of young refugees, such as those that I have been talking recently, for example? And you can see one of those participants' board on the other side of your screen, where they talk, where he and many other teenage refugees talk about how hot Wi-Fi is in the city and how they move around the city trying to find that reliable and free Wi-Fi to sustain the important connections in their lives. So moving beyond those articulations of the digital city through infrastructures, through investment, and through the priorities of the state and the corporations, we can see another kind of humanism emerging through the use of different communication technologies by people in the margin, such as those that I'm talking about here. And I'll give you some of those examples of how a different kind of demotic humanism might emerge in that same side where progressive values are used also by those in power to suppress freedom and equality. So we can see, for example, a not so curious human centrism in the case of migrants and the urban subaltern in the way that they imagine the digital city and the way that they locate themselves in digital cities. So you can see here a picture of Rihanna's phone. Rihanna is a 15-year-old Afghan refugee in Athens, And she's showing me her Instagram site where she's posing in front of the train, of the metro train in Athens, where she imagines herself as part of the city, and the city is part of the making of herself. And this is someone who lives in complete destitution, but who is dreaming of becoming a model, and is someone who's constructing this image of herself, of how she imagines herself through those imaginaries, those digital imaginaries of the city. We see other imaginaries, digitally mediated imaginaries, such as those of Ali, a participant in my project on the digital cities of refuge, as transgender man in Berlin, who is imagining the big city as a healing space, and who uses connectivities, physical, material, but also digital connectivities, to try to find healing and to surpass the trauma that comes with uprooting, imprisonment as a political refugee, and also his own journey through gender transformation. We see uses, forms of articulation of the digital city through those of Anas. And Anas is a Syrian young refugee who imagines the city as a space of voice, and who has come, as you can see on the screen. He says that the only thing that I brought with me from Syria are the shrapnels from a bomb that were in my body when I came to Berlin. But now he's developed an online Arabic newspaper in Berlin, developing a site, again, a digital Berlin-based and Berlin-focused a space for voice and for making claims in the city for migrants and refugees. And we can see imaginings also of the city as part of complex and diverse identities among people on the margins. We see voices, digital voices, as those of Sadhu, who is a young refugee in Berlin again, who represents himself by developing a digital narrative where he emphasizes his multiple identities. I think of myself as refugee, but also as a Berliner, and ultimately a student. We see conceptions of the self and the conception of the urban human from the margins that is not just individual and individualistic, but also located within the different structures of social and communicative inequalities, as those as we can see here from a refugee woman in London that talks to us about how she's constantly hacked on Twitter. She doesn't give up, but also how she tries to manage her attempt to use her digital voice at the same time of being a full-time carer to her disabled daughter, reflecting this attempt for humans to be part of collective and individual struggles, again, to find a place as human within systems of inequality that marginalize them, but also to which they want to make place for presence and rights. And we can see that demotic, that vernacular humanism that we see from the margins is not only about discourse, and it's not only about how people might be narrating the digital city, but it's also about the experience of marginality and destitution, because people and the humans who live in the margins have those biographies that are situated in histories of conflict and dehumanizing national and global political affairs. For example, the Tarek family who had to flee their village in Iraq because it was first bombed by the Americans, then occupied by ISIS, then burned down and completely destroyed by Shia militia. Now they have no other choice but to try to move in the city, and apart from moving in a city that is not necessarily very welcoming to them, they do spend hours browsing Facebook, trying to find a space of connection with the city, but also with people in other parts of the world. So what and to give just a few more examples here, and this is from my very recent research that I have conducted with teenage refugees in Athens in December, we can see also that a very experiential human centrism of the subaltern practices of the digital cities, not only of the narratives of the digital city among those at the margins. We see in the first quotation where a 14-year-old boy says, I hacked WhatsApp because I was worried about a boy at the camp that my brother hangs out with. He's not a good boy. I wanted to see what he's saying on WhatsApp. So we see key fundamental values, humanist values taking place here, care and self-organization from that position of marginality, adopting digital tools, but also adapting to the digital governmentality of the life of the self and the marginalized self in the camp. In the second and third quotation, we see, for example, a female Afghan refugee saying, I learned English on YouTube and I'm now learning German. That's the only way to learn. And I'm hoping I will go to Berlin soon to be with my mom. The next one reads, I use YouTube to progress with my school lessons. At school, all teaching is in Greek, so often I cannot follow and need to catch up online. So what we see here is, again, that very experiential humanism, the creative human capabilities as a fundamental human trait, where those kids that have no access to the formal or very limited access to formal infrastructures of the city, using the digital infrastructures to find a place in the world. In the next two quotations, we read, with Google Maps, I can get to know everything about the city. I also go to YouTube to know more about what people do here and about the city's culture. And then we are always on Instagram. Why? This is how boys and girls meet. So again, some very fundamental human desires to find a place in the world, and the desire to belong and connect takes place in the digital city, even though the struggle with that physical space of the city is there and it is important. I'm going to skip the next couple of slides so that I can come to talk a bit more. I think I gave a number of examples of how I understand the narratives, but also the practices of what I refer to as the demotic humanism of the digital city. So I talked about the popular humanism that is used as a tool to manage from the top the crisis of the capitalist city. I'm referring to demotic humanism to talk about how people from the margins, from the top down, they use the digital city and the digital infrastructures to manage, to tackle experiences of dehumanization and to try to find themselves as human in a hostile, urban and transnational world. So what is demotic humanism about? Again, drawing on hooks, the way that I understand those material relates primarily, first of all, to voice and to the marginality of digital voice in this case. And in Hook's words, and of course she's not talking about the digital, but I think it's very appropriate here. She says, when you hear the broken voice, you also hear the pain contained within that brokenness. A speech of suffering. Often it's that sound that nobody wants to hear. So it is those digital spaces that very often provide to people in the margins those opportunities to speak with voices that are not voices as those captured on the idealized, digital savvy, resilient, a subject of popular humanism, but it is a space of speaking with their own voice. And what they often do, and the examples that I showed, I understand them as being opportunities sometimes of reclaiming marginality through digital claims. So again, as Hooke says, the margins are much more than a site of deprivation. It is also the site of radical possibility, a space of resistance. And some of those quotes of the young people who try to learn the city, learn the world, learn new skills on YouTube, for example, I think capture very well those attempts to find not only voice, but also to resist this full the full exclusion that they experience. The digital city from the margins is also showing us this resisting how people at the margins resist containment and assortment of humans, and instead develop agentive capabilities to challenge an order that selectively humanizes some while dehumanizing others. In the narrative of the popular humanism, these young people that I quoted before do not exist. They don't have the capital to buy infrastructure, the advanced digital tools or infrastructures. They are not integrated in the society, but they are there to develop their own capabilities as humans to exist in the city. And these experiences also show the potentiality of humans and technology to support and generate positive, radical, and democratic change at times and spaces of acute marginality. And I will come back on my conclusions to show that this is not, of course, it's anything but a utopian space. And these kids might be able to learn some things from YouTube, but they still remain outside the system of education, for example, that will help them have a really secured future. So there are some opportunities, but of course those opportunities are always subjected to the huge inequalities and the huge structural boundaries that people in the margins face. So this brings me to the last of the three main parts of my lecture, where I am thinking about the critique and how do we understand those different claims to humanity, those that are taking place from the top in a narrative way to contain crisis and to sustain order in the city, and those narratives that come, narratives and practices that come from the periphery, when people who have no access to resources and recognition reclaim their own humanity, and partly digitally. And here is where I'm thinking about critical humanism as an interpretative framework, as an academic response to those conflicting humanism. And I understand a critical humanism as an important lens to respond and to interpret what is going on in the digital city. So I think through critical humanism because I see, again, in narratives from the top and from the bottom, as the human becoming more and more of an important figure, a driving category when we think about what can technology do, or what should technology do or not do to our cities and our lives. So the human becomes a prominent category, but of course an ambivalent figure, both for control and for freedom. And critical humanism, I think, is necessary to try to understand why we should think about the human, and to start from the human and not contain our analysis of digital cities on within technology and technological perspectives. And I understand the value of a critical humanist response on three levels: epistemologically, theoretically, and ethico-politically. So epistemologically, I'm referring to critical humanism as a means for recognizing urban humans as neither essential and stable existences, nor fully determined either by the structural conditions or by technology, but instead as pluralized speaking agents constituted through discourse and practice that need to be studied within historicized and specialized context. So while the category of the human becomes important, I hope that it became obvious through the different examples that I use that humans are both, they live the city differently, but also they're constituted as a category on behalf of whom many claims are made by those in power, and they're within those claims they're understood differently. So the human is not a stable category, but it is a category that is now re-emerging, I think, as important to understand what's going on with digital transformation in cities within the crisis of capitalism. Theoretically, critical humanism situates urban humanity within histories of oppression, but also of collective struggle, through which individuals and collectivities are relationally constituted. Both trajectories of oppression and struggle are increasingly mediated in digital narratives and infrastructures that divide the city anew, but not in non-fully determinant ways. So again, theoretically, my research reminds me that we have to think about humans both as categories that might be appropriated to advance dominant interests, but they are never fully contained within the interest of the elites. And ethico-politically critical humanism opens up the digital city to both a critical and normative analysis. It recognizes human capabilities to both resist and use technologies for advancing freedom and social justice. So this, of course, means that we cannot just be observant of the different claims on behalf of the humans, but to also recognize the spaces of freedom and the spaces of resistance and possibility for humans to actually make claim to the city and to social justice. So this brings me to my final few points, where I want to highlight that I understand these debates around the digital city, the transformations of our cities through technology, as a complex side where some key struggles around ideology, order, and control take place at present. We have to think, I think, beyond the dominant frames that think of technology either as being a struggle between the human and the machine, or between the human and the machinery of power. So just thinking about how humans are absorbed by surveillance capitalism or of data colonialism, and actually recognize by actually us as researchers, as well as seeing the human and listening to the humans, that those sides of technological transformations are sides of struggle, and they involve competing claims and competing humanism on behalf of different actors in the city. So I have tried to also explain how those struggles are taking place around different forms of revived humanism. And to summarize, I spoke of popular humanism as the top-down socio-technical imaginaries that are pushed across different cities of the world, and which incorporate progressive discourse that pushes away the language of racial neoliberalism and data capitalism, because those are bankrupt and mistrusted languages, But however, even though popular humanism projects these progressive values for the human-led world, it universalizes, of course, whiteness, privilege, and the normativity of digital futures, that it is through digital transformations that things are getting better. And of course, digital transformation that comes with assumed resources that we should have to buy into all the digital innovation. As a result, these narratives of popular humanism marginalize radical claims to transformation and to recognition of the different urban humanities and the different rights to the digital city. Demotic humanism, on the other hand, is a concept that I use to understand the narratives and the experiences of the digital city from the margins, and represents, in my eyes, the everyday acts of resistance from the urban margins. And margins are and remain sites of radical possibility to articulate humanizing, attentive, and subversive digital discourses and practices against the dehumanizing technologies of data capitalism. So we shouldn't forget that the narratives of the young people that we saw before are shaping technological imaginaries as much as those of data capitalism and the aggressive advance of the narratives and the economic interest of those in control of the big tech. And critical humanism is the third kind of humanism I wanted to talk about, which is a critique and response to the conflicting humanism of the different city. And I understand it as a process of witnessing, analyzing, and contesting the identification of injustices through the incorporation of a language of progress, inclusion, and sustainability that obscures, however, inequalities and their reproduction through the digital promise. And to conclude, just very briefly, to say that what I tried to do in this analysis about the competing humanism of the digital city is to try to contribute and sustain that dialogue about the contradictory forces and the struggles around power that take place around digital change, and how we are seeing a shift of those debates around technological change from being about just the reproduction of neoliberal capitalism to being about that promise of a human and a humanistic world, and to be cautious and also aware of what this kind of humanism represents. I think those debates around competing humanism also invites us or demands from us to understand what the value and the meaning of the human is, with capital H or with small h. And of course, when we talk about humanism, very often we do have to be aware of the critique, and the rightly so critique, that locates humanism in the racial and colonizing history of European Enlightenment and its trajectories, but not while being aware of it, and that's why I'm talking about critical humanism, while being aware of the racial and discriminating epistemologies of Enlightenment humanism, we should be aware, not throw away those values that are very much important for the people of the city, and to revisit and understand humanity in its plurality, and beyond those conceptions that there is only one kind of human, as now we see revived, for example, in popular humanism. And this is a call for the recognition of humans in plural, and not in that general sense of diversity, but in their ontological plurality associated with human capabilities, and the structural plurality created through different histories and systems of exclusion, which hopefully can contribute to building digital cities that reflect, as Bembe puts it, a great universal future, equitably open to all people, all nations, and all species. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Myria Georgiou, for your inspiring and fascinating talk on the digital city and the contested humanisms as claims to this digital city. Before we go to the questions, I would like to thank and to Luis Coutinho, who is one of our PhD researchers, who's helping us both with the translation of the slides for the next conference with Bart Kamartz, and also with the backstage technical assistance. And thank you for being with us, for helping us, Luis, and especially in very short notice, because we decided to do it online just recently. And I would like also to remind you all, I'm going to speak in Portuguese, excuse me, Myria. Gostaria de convidar a todos e todas que estão nos assistindo agora para daqui a menos de uma hora a conferência, a segunda conferência do dia, com o professor Bart Kamartz, que vai falar sobre a normalização da justiça social e a normalização do discurso neofascista na política, na mídia contemporânea. Então, é um outro link, mas é aqui mesmo, nesse mesmo site do PPG-Com, ok? Myria, there is one question here by Simone Pereira, who's a colleague from another institution. She's asking, she's considering the relation between, one, these ways of claiming the city and the digital city through the margins, since they are margins, and two, the notion of solidarity, digital solidarities that you have already talked about, especially in the other conference, how they can be seen as ways to construct, to build digital solidarities. I mean, the margins, how does this way of seeing the margins can build digital solidarities? How can they modify or move or even complexify the notion, the original notion of digital solidarity? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I think Simone has just added something, or is it just the same? I see on my screen.
The same questions, but it's projected so people can read it in Portuguese when, yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you for this important question, which has many different dimensions. I'll try to address as effectively as I can. So my attempt to talk about these different ways of thinking and being human in the city is precisely an attempt to show how some of the categories through which we think about politics are also conceptualized in different ways. So in the top-down, what I refer to as popular humanist narratives, for example, we see articulations and incorporations of meanings of digital solidarity in ways that we're quite familiar with digital solidarity, I think, at present, especially in relation to hashtag activism. Right? So we see corporations, we see the state, we see the media buying in and projecting this kind of hashtag activism and the progressive values, feminism and racial justice as a form of digital solidarity that is only possible, or it can be advanced precisely because we have those digital tools to advance it, right? So we have this kind of top-down digital solidarity that, of course, always contains and incorporates those progressive values, so that they don't really tackle the real deep structural inequalities. What happens from the margins is that we have, I think, both. I don't want to think, and my reference to bell hooks is precisely to show that margins is not necessarily just something else. but it is part of that mainstream society of what we might refer in this case as digital cities, but is not necessarily recognized by the mainstream narratives of the digital cities. So we see forms of digital solidarity or digital governmentality from the margins that is not sometimes so different to that of the digital solidarity that we see in hegemonic ways. So the case of the boy that hacks WhatsApp, for example, is very complex because he's also doing this kind of, he adapts that logic of surveillance that is very central to the ideas and the ideals of what digital societies and digital cities should be about. So it's just one example. Or the girl who takes those Instagram photos in the city that are very much copying what she sees on Pinterest. And she says that she's trying to copy things like she sees on Pinterest, right? So the margins are also part of the way of being, of representing and self-representing, as it's widely circulated in hegemonic conceptions of digitization, including also digital solidarity. But also, of course, what we have in the margins is also something else. So we have this, we have populations and we have voices that are very, very often pushed aside, lacking recognition, being outside the imaginaries of the present and the future city. So what we see is articulations and uses of digital technologies to create those alternative, peripheral, but also unseen spaces of solidarity. So we see networks of solidarity that are functional in the margins, and partly they're functional and effective as forms of solidarity because they're unseen. So because they're not in the attention of the mainstream, they can be much more effective. So people who support each other so they can cross borders, for example, right? And partly it's marginality itself that makes certain forms of digital solidarity effective. We see also forms of digital solidarity that depend on self-care, collective self-care, and development of distinct digital skills, which people have to develop because they don't have any other ways to get access to resources, right? Like education and so on. So we have, so to conclude, I'm sorry, I have been going on for a while. To conclude, we have these different layers and different meanings and practices of digital solidarity taking place in the digital city. And in the margins, we see both the incorporation, both the reproduction of these kind of very mainstream or superficial forms of digital solidarity, but also of potentials to think of new forms of digital solidarity that can emerge both because of digital affordances and because of that precisely the invisibility of the margins.
Thank you very much, Myria. We have another question here from Carol, who's co-organizing of these conferences and seminars we had. She's asking, Myria, I'm here connecting your talk with Bart, so I'd like to ask you about the use of these imaginaries of the digital city, especially the more technocentrist discourses by governments, especially alt-right and neo-fascist governments. For instance, recently in Brazil, there has been some discussions about 5G and the sale of the rights to explore it was very much propagated, advertising by Bolsonaro's government. And it gained a lot of media attention without any problematization about what it means, in fact, for Brazilians. So she was wondering if this kind of use is common in other places and how you see this.
Thank you, Carol. I have to first give a disclaimer that, of course, my answer comes from ignorance of the context of Brazil, but it is an attempt to speak on some of the knowledge that I'm trying to gain that goes beyond from my research from different parts of the world. I think what happens in many parts of the world, and what I have seen in the case of the city, and why one of the reasons I'm talking about this progressive popular humanism that cities progress, is that we see the rise of cities and in movements that are concentrated on cities that contest the hegemonic politics of the nation. So we have, for example, the rise of the municipalist movements, which are movements that in different countries, and municipalist movements became quite prominent in Spain initially, but they expand across the world. We see them in the US as well, and we saw them at the times of Trump presidency. We have movements that are generated by the cities and by city authorities that contest directly the politics of the nation, especially in this context where we see national politics of extreme populism. And I think this is a very interesting moment. We also have international networks of cities, such as there is a network which, apologies, I don't remember the exact names. We have a network of cities across the world, which is called something about a network for digital justice. We have networks of cities across the world for racial justice, and so on and so forth. So there is a parallel movement of cities that exist against or in contrast to the nations that I think is part of this specific moment when we see populist right-wing governments on the rise on a national level. What we see is very often the rise of urban governments as more progressive voices that try to contest this authority. And we can see that, for example, as I said, that global movement of city governments for digital justice is that precise example. And I don't remember now if there are any Brazilian cities as part of that network. I apologize for that, but it's easy to find on the web. So mayors around the world want to push this idea of digital justice so that resources are more equitably distributed. And again, I think we have this push from city governments because cities are sites of difference. They're sites where these social movements, as Bart will be possibly talking about, but the ones I refer to are on the rise. So urban government has to respond, but also incorporate, of course, these more progressive voices to continue having their own legitimacy within the urban world. I hope that's useful.
Thank you, Myria. We have a last question here from our colleague Angela from FMG, and she's saying that she congratulates you for the conference and says that she considers very productive the notion of margins as a space of an encounter of flux, of fluxus, of passage, and of construction and reconstruction of forms of life, ways of life. How the production from the margins is articulated with the question or vulnerability of the migrants. I'm not sure if não sei, gente, se eu traduzi bem, mas eu acho que deu para ter uma ideia.
Yes, I mean, I think, I mean, please come back, Angela, if I misunderstood. I think I understand what the question is. So I think it's about this paradox, right? And about this contradiction of the margins. So the margins is a space of possibility, and it is a space of agency. And bell hooks was the one to remind us of that again and again, that idea of the radical possibility. And again, my research confirms that, meeting people who are completely deprived of any from any access to the most basic resources of the city, and they find ways to survive, but also to make the best that they can within the conditions of full deprivation, full dehumanization, and misrecognition that they experience. So I think it's very important, and for me, it's very important to keep that in mind, especially at times when we have these debates on surveillance capitalism and data colonialism and so on. We should not forget the human and the agentive human as a force of change and as a force of resistance and mobilization. At the same time, of course, the possibilities that you have if you're completely deprived from access to resources, to formal education, for example, and you only have to depend on YouTube, they're not to be underestimated as deeply as forms of reproduction of deep structural inequalities. That's why I think it's important, and that's why I'm trying to work around these three different concepts of humanism, that we have a popular humanism that does not really see these inequalities in a meaningful way. We have a demotic humanism where people are trying to live to make the best they can within these inequalities. But my proposal for critical humanism is precisely because we have to keep thinking and putting forward the limits of not to do both, to recognize the potential of agency and the potentials of technology to support agency or co-support agency, but also to not lose sight of the deep structural inequalities that limit the potentials of migrants or other populations or the urban poor, the urban underclass to sustain meaningful access to resources, to dignity, and to recognition in the long run. I hope this was, I understood the question correctly and I answered it appropriately.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you very much to you all who came and made questions and participated on this event. And we're wrapping then this part of the events of today with Professor Myria Georgiou, and at 4 o'clock, we're having the next conference. Okay, so thank you, Myria, very much. Thank you, Luiz, obrigada, Luiz, por estar nos bastidores e nos ajudar com a viabilização desse evento online. And Myria, we hope we see you again soon. Thank you so much for being with us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.